In the early pre-dawn hours of December 16th, 2020, this Piper Cherokee and these two young men would meet an abrupt end upon impacting the ground in a wooded portion of the Barksdale Air Force Base near Shreveport, Louisiana. Darkness and poor weather suggest the pilot may have experienced spatial disorientation, a common killer in general aviation. Is that what happened here, or is there more to the story? Find out coming up. Before delving into the details of this event, it's worth explaining the difference between VFR flight and IFR flight for the benefit of viewers who might not be pilots. Those of you who are pilots should feel free to skip ahead to the next section. VFR stands for Visual Flight Rules, and it's the kind of flying that every pilot starts out with. Pilots who want to expand their capabilities or who are pursuing a professional career in flying would need to undergo the necessary training to become certified to fly under IFR, Instrument Flight Rules. IFR is a very different system of flying from VFR. It's essentially an entirely different kind of flying altogether.
An entirely different kind of flying.
VFR flying is kind of like boating. So long as boaters follow some basic rules, including applicable law and any local policies for the particular waters they're operating in, they have a substantial amount of freedom to operate their boats as they please. VFR pilots are mainly restricted by weather conditions. They can't fly into a cloud, nor can they fly when the visibility drops. They're also restricted by airspace. Certain areas, usually those around busy airports, require VFR pilots to initiate and maintain radio contact with air traffic control, while airspace at and above 18,000 feet is off limits entirely. But for VFR flights outside of such areas, no radio contact is required. In any case, VFR pilots are responsible for their own traffic separation and must maintain continuous outside vigilance to see and avoid other aircraft. IFR flying is more like operating on a busy railroad. Since only one train can use a portion of track at a time, train movements are tightly controlled and coordinated. IFR flights have a substantial set of rules, regulations, and procedures they must follow. Traffic separation is provided by air traffic control, so all flights are closely monitored. Routes are either flown along networks of airways with only one aircraft being allowed on a section of airway at a time, or they are separated with the aid of radar. The benefit of following all the procedures and regulations associated with IFR is that the range of weather conditions that pilots can fly in is dramatically increased. In fact, VFR weather requirements are primarily designed to be the bare minimum necessary to allow for the see and avoid method to prevent mid-air collisions. But it's not the only reason for weather minimums, and arguably not even the most important reason, as non-instrument rated pilots simply have not been trained in aircraft control and navigation in restricted visibility. As visibility decreases, the natural horizon disappears, and pilots must rely on the flight instruments to maintain aircraft control. Although the concept of this sounds simple, it can actually be a very challenging task to perform without the proper training. A person's sense of balance and orientation, which comes from the vestibular and somatosensory systems, is easily confused in flight. Without visual information, it's impossible to distinguish the force of gravity from other forces, including turning, accelerating, pitching, and other aircraft movements. If you've ever spun around in a swivel chair with your eyes closed and had trouble determining whether the chair had stopped or reversed direction, then you're familiar with at least one of the illusions pilots can fall victim to without visual information. During instrument training, pilots learn not only to disregard a range of vestibular and somatosensory illusions, but also to scan the flight instruments in a carefully choreographed, systematic fashion, interpret their readings, and then take the information gathered from the individual instruments and put it together into a cohesive whole, forming an awareness of the aircraft's orientation and flight path. To give you an idea of the amount of training needed, a private pilot certificate requires a minimum of 40 hours of flight time. An instrument rating requires another 40 hours of instrument flight time. The time, cost, and commitment involved in acquiring an instrument rating is akin to learning to fly all over again. Pilots untrained in instrument flight are likely to succumb to sensory illusions whenever the real horizon is obscured. The result is spatial disorientation, often leading to a graveyard spiral. A graveyard spiral begins when the aircraft enters a shallow bank turn that goes unnoticed. Due to aerodynamic forces, if the pilot does not intervene, the turn tends to tighten more and more, and as the bank steepens, the nose drops. This situation can unfold gradually at first and then rapidly accelerate, with the descent rate increasing exponentially. Like the proverbial frog being boiled alive, the pilot typically does not realize he's in a so-called graveyard spiral until it's too late to recover. A disoriented pilot can even hasten the process by making incorrect control inputs. So was this crash the end result of a graveyard spiral? Let's take a closer look. The aircraft was a 1973 Piper PA-28180, this particular edition being dubbed by Piper as the Cherokee Challenger. It's a 4-seat airplane, has a 180 horsepower engine, and is relatively simple to operate with a fixed pitch propeller and fixed landing gear. The Cherokee Challenger was the immediate predecessor to the Piper Archer, which is still in production. Like most small airplanes, the Cherokee was not equipped with a flight data recorder, but it did have the next best thing. On board were 2 devices that recorded GPS position data, and these were successfully recovered during the investigation. The data from each device matched the other, as well as the track recorded by air traffic control radar. At the controls of the Piper Cherokee was 18-year-old Jet Montgomery. He grew up across the river from Shreveport and Bossier City, Louisiana, and graduated from one of the city's high schools in 2020 amidst the height of the coronavirus pandemic. He had begun his freshman year at Louisiana Tech and was majoring in finance. Jet had started taking flying lessons the summer of his high school graduation, and sometime later that summer or in early fall, his father, Jason Montgomery, purchased the Piper Cherokee that would be involved in the crash. It was probably purchased on or around September 12th when Jet posted this photo to his Instagram page. This time frame was backed up by the airplane's previous owner, and the manager at the Shreveport Downtown Airport confirmed that the Montgomerys were renting a hangar there for their newly acquired airplane. But at the time of the crash, Jet only had a student pilot certificate. Student pilots may fly solo upon meeting certain training requirements, obtaining a logbook endorsement from their flight instructor, and following the limitations established by the FAA and the limitations in their logbook endorsements. Under no circumstances may a student pilot carry a passenger. The passenger was 19-year-old Jonathan Cole Harris. He went to the same high school as Jet, but graduated a year before him. He had completed a year at Northwestern State University of Louisiana, but decided to change tracks and had recently begun attending a program in Shreveport to become a welder. It is not known whether Jonathan was aware of Jet's status as a student pilot or whether he knew the flight would be illegal. The flight originated from DTN, Shreveport Downtown Airport, several hours before sunrise. Although this airport has a control tower, the tower was closed at the time, thus pilots would revert to the procedures used for an uncontrolled airport by using the see and avoid concept and communicating with each other on the common traffic advisory frequency. An airport security camera recorded a vehicle, presumably Jet Montgomery and Jonathan Harris, passing through the airport gate at 3:15 a.m. local time on December 16th. The Garmin GPS began recording position data at 3:39 a.m. However, the aircraft sat motionless for the next 8 minutes. It then moves about 50 feet, where it then sits for 12 minutes. It's possible this first movement was by way of a tow bar and that the engine was not started until later. At 4:00 a.m., the aircraft begins moving again, presumably this time under its own power. It then taxis to runway 14 despite winds being out of the northwest at 5 to 10 knots, which would favor runway 32. That being said, despite being non-optimal, the runway was plenty long enough for a tailwind takeoff. The airplane, for whatever reason, sits just short of the runway for another 10 minutes. Airport records indicate the pilot-controlled lighting was activated around 4:12 or 4:15 a.m. At 4:17 a.m., the aircraft takes off from runway 14. The aircraft initiates a left turn after takeoff. This would have been a typical procedure Jet probably followed many times and was necessary to avoid this Class C airspace. Even though the DTN control tower is closed, this area is active. Being associated with SHV, the larger and busier Shreveport Regional Airport, as well as BAD, the Barksdale Air Force Base, the area would require communication with air traffic controllers prior to entry 24 hours a day. After traveling north for a short time, however, the aircraft begins turning left again and ventures into the controlled airspace area without authorization and continues in a roughly east-southeast direction. A civilian controller at Shreveport Approach Control, the dimly lit radar room located below the glass-enclosed tower cab at SHV, sees the aircraft on radar and calls the military controllers at the Barksdale Air Force Base to tell them that an unidentified aircraft is heading their way. The presence of this aircraft would have been surprising to the controller, not only because the aircraft did not obtain the proper authorization to operate in this area, but also because the aircraft's radar transponder was transmitting the standard code to indicate the flight was operating under VFR, even though weather conditions across the entire region were solidly below the VFR minimums. Barksdale Tower, believing the aircraft to be in distress and or lost, responded by turning the airport lighting up to its maximum brightness level. They also attempted to establish contact with the aircraft by radio, but did not get a response. The airplane's radio was probably still tuned to the frequency for DTN, and Barksdale's communication attempts were most likely not heard. The aircraft continued flying in an erratic but generally easterly direction. During most of the flight, GPS altitude varied between about 400 feet above ground level and about 1,400 feet. Strangely, the plane's speed was below 90 knots for most of the flight. Eventually, the aircraft entered what might be a graveyard spiral and crashed about 5 miles east of BID's runway on a disused and forested portion of the base. Due to the remote location, it would take several hours for search and recovery crews to reach the downed aircraft, but the high speed of the impact would have left a negligible chance for survival. When John F. Kennedy Jr. crashed his Piper Saratoga, a 6-seat derivative of the Cherokee, he was en route to Martha's Vineyard on a dark night with a thick summer haze in the air. While over the ocean, the horizon disappeared into a vast, inky blackness, and even though the flight was fully legal with weather conditions above VFR minimums, JFK fell into the spatial disorientation trap, killing himself, his wife, and his sister-in-law. As stated earlier, weather in the Shreveport area the night of Jet's crash was below the minimum for VFR. The latest weather at DTN prior to takeoff indicated an overcast cloud layer starting at only 300 feet above the ground, while Barksdale reported overcast cloud bases fluctuating between 400 and 500 feet AGL. Meteorological modeling suggested the cloud layer was several thousand feet thick, and about 2 hours after the crash, an airline crew departing SHV reported the clouds on their way up. They entered the cloud base at about 400 feet above ground level and did not get above them until 3,000 feet AGL. This means Jet's airplane probably entered clouds less than 1 minute after takeoff. It may have remained in the clouds for almost the entire duration of the flight, but considering the large altitude fluctuations, it may have descended below the bottom of the cloud layer for a few brief periods. To an uninformed viewer, the flight track may look like a pilot who is sightseeing, but the weather conditions make this unlikely. Additionally, the lack of any sustained period of time where the airplane flew straight and level, except for just after takeoff prior to entering the clouds, is suggestive of a pilot having trouble with basic aircraft control. This tight turn may look like an attempt to circle an interesting landmark, but here there's probably a 50-50 chance of the airplane being completely engulfed in the cloud layer. There isn't anything particularly interesting on the ground at this location either. There is a high school nearby, but it's not the one Jet and Jonathan attended. The figure 8 over the Air Force runway is interesting. It may be a coincidence, or Jet may have seen the faint glow of airport lights through the clouds and flew toward it for a closer look. It's impossible to know for sure. Jumping ahead to the flight's final moments, the shape and arrangement of these circles might lead one to believe the airplane is at least somewhat under positive control by the pilot, but one must consider the effect of wind. Observed wind at BAD just before and after the crash was out of the northwest at 9 knots. Of course, that's surface wind, and when at higher altitudes is almost always stronger. These barbs on the SKU-T log-P diagram show wind predictions for different altitudes at the time and place of the crash. For the altitude range where the Cherokee was flying, the likely wind is out of the northwest at 10 to 15 knots. These turns are offset at an angle that lines up almost perfectly with the direction of the wind barbs on the SKU-T log-P chart, and I measured the amount of offset of each turn to be equivalent to a 13-knot southeast drift, which matches the predicted speed of the wind as well. Therefore, the peculiar shape and position of these circles can be explained entirely by wind and not by any conscious pilot actions. Most likely, the bank is steadily increasing throughout this portion of the flight. Even though the radius of the final 2 turns looks similar, the aircraft's speed is steadily increasing, and increased speed will offset the effect of steeper bank angles on turn radius. All things considered, it can be concluded that these circles are the classic graveyard spiral pilots can end up in when suffering from spatial disorientation. This student pilot violated the limitations of his student pilot certificate, the conditions placed upon him by his flight instructor, and attempted an unlawful flight into weather conditions that were also well below the legal minimum. The decision-making and judgment displayed is nothing short of reckless. Flight in these conditions would have been nearly impossible for any non-instrument rated pilot, let alone a student. The bigger question is, why did he do it? Jet started flying in June of 2020 at Tubro Aviation. His main flight instructor, who I'll refer to as Fred, stated the first phase of Jet's training did not go well. Fred had to do most of the flying because Jet was more interested in taking pictures and showing off on social media. While I understand the popularity of social media, it's not typical for student pilots who are spending a lot of money and time on flight training to prioritize that over the task at hand. Most quickly get over any initial sense of novelty and focus on the learning process after a flight or 2. Jet's lackluster attitude continued throughout at least his first 10 hours. By the 10-hour point, most student pilots are getting close to their first solo. Apparently, Fred had some frank discussions with him, basically telling him he needed to start to take his training seriously or else it was time to quit. Instructors don't usually want to turn away business, so encouraging students to quit is done only in extreme cases. Fred even said that Jet's parents expressed frustration over the lack of progress. That and the level of apathy toward learning Jet displayed made me suspicious that flying was not necessarily his idea. Anyway, according to Fred, after numerous talks and discussions, Jet's attitude finally started to change. He began taking his training more seriously, eventually completing his first solo flight in August and moving on to the next phase of the training process. During this period, Fred had some out-of-town commitments, so Jet would sometimes fly with other instructors, but they always kept Fred up to date on Jet's progress. One told Fred that Jet was almost ready for his first solo cross-country flight, a required milestone in training during which the student pilot flies solo to another airport at least 50 miles away. However, when Fred returned, Jet showed up to a flying lesson appearing to be impaired and also smelling faintly of alcohol. Other instructors observed this as well, and together the group decided to show Jet the door and permanently bar him from training at Tubro Aviation. After getting kicked out of the flight school, Jet and his father hired a freelance instructor who I'll call Ron to teach them to fly in their Piper Cherokee. Around 10 p.m. on December 15th, Jet stopped by Ron's house to pick up the airplane manual, stating that he needed it for a solo cross-country flight he was planning for the next day. Ron had not yet flown with either Jet or his father, but had borrowed the airplane's owner's manual in order to get acquainted with the characteristics of that particular model. Jet's request would have been very surprising, as it's the instructor's job to guide the student through the training process. Student pilots cannot fly solo cross-country flights without getting a logbook endorsement for each individual flight, with the instructor being required to review the student's planning and weather each time. Naturally, Ron had no intention of giving Jet any logbook endorsements without flying with him and evaluating him first. That night, Ron also took Jet outside and, looking up at the ominous cloudy sky, explained in detail how the weather forecasts for that night and the entire next day were utterly unsuitable for flying. Ron believed that Jet understood his explanation. It is standard procedure for the NTSB to perform autopsies on the pilots of fatal accidents. This one revealed no evidence the student pilot had ingested alcohol, however, it did find amphetamine in his bloodstream. It turned out Jet had a prescription for Vyvanse, an amphetamine derivative stimulant medication used to treat ADHD. But the level of amphetamine in his bloodstream was significantly higher than would be achievable even with the maximum prescribed dose. For some perspective, some countries have established legal limits for driving under the influence of amphetamines. Jet's amphetamine concentration was between the Norwegian likely impaired level and the highly impaired level. Vyvanse comes in a range of doses from 10 to 70 milligrams. Doses above 70 milligrams per day are not approved. According to this study, at a 70 milligram daily dose taken for several days, blood concentrations of amphetamine would peak at 92 nanograms per milliliter in Japanese study participants with a standard deviation of 16.5 nanograms. I'm using the Japanese group because their average weight is a closer match for Jet's reported body weight, and it's more favorable to Jet as the Japanese group reached higher concentrations than the Caucasian group. There is a linear relationship between oral dose and the resulting blood concentration. Even if Jet's dose response was an outlier at the end of the 95% confidence interval, he still would have needed to take at a minimum a triple dose of Vyvanse to reach the concentration found in his blood. Using the true mean, however, it is actually more likely he took a quadruple dose. The mean time to peak blood concentration is 5 hours with a range of 3 to 8 hours. This means he probably took the Vyvanse pills shortly before midnight, however, he could have also taken them spread throughout the evening and early morning. One wonders whether Jet had been abusing his medication for a while, but investigators did not dig deeper on this. The student pilot's abuse of his medication is not the only problem in this story. The FAA has a de facto ban on pilots flying while taking prescription amphetamines at any dose. Plus, people with a diagnosis of ADHD are disqualified from obtaining an FAA medical certificate unless they undergo a complicated and costly battery of neuropsychiatric tests. Except for student pilots learning to fly a light sport aircraft, a medical certificate is required before students can make solo flights. Progress in flight training would hit a wall without one. Jet had obtained an FAA medical certificate, but there's no evidence he underwent any of the required testing. So how did Jet obtain an FAA medical certificate despite his prescription for Vyvanse and his ADHD diagnosis? The NTSB discovered that Jet did not disclose either of these on his medical certificate application. That leaves only two possibilities. Either he was diagnosed and medicated recently, which seems unlikely because his father told investigators that Jet had been taking the medication for a while, or Jet simply omitted this information on his FAA medical application. The act of making false statements on an FAA medical application, including lies of omission or concealment, is subject to fines up to $250,000, imprisonment for up to 5 years, or both. On FlightAware, I found a set of flights the night before Thanksgiving, just 3 weeks before the crash, possibly during the time Jet was in between instructors. The flights show Jet's airplane flying from DTN to an airport near Dallas, going on what looks like a sightseeing flight and returning to DTN at night. At first, I thought these might have been more examples of Jet flying illegally, but Jet apparently had a friend from Bossier City who was a certified private pilot. It appears that it was this friend who was at the controls on this series of flights. Despite being perfectly legal, these flights, especially the night cross-country portion, would have been without the proper context provided by a CFI, and may have given Jet the false impression that he could accomplish a similar flight by himself. It is still possible to imagine that Jet may have partaken in other unauthorized flights prior to the crash flight. If he did, those two would have given him a misplaced sense of confidence that he could break rules and fly without the proper training while not suffering any consequences. Wrapping up this analysis, one lingering question is how the passenger ended up on this flight. Was Jonathan under the influence of a substance as well, or simply persuaded by his friendship with Jet to go along with this ill-conceived plan? Perhaps Jet was as dishonest with his friend as he was with others. In either case, the NTSB does not normally investigate passengers or autopsy them, since outside of unusual situations like hijacking or coercion, a passenger cannot logically be held responsible for the outcome of a flight. This student pilot's crash seems like a foregone conclusion, but I believe that the aviation community can learn even from the most outrageous examples of bad airmanship. The FAA wants all pilots to be conscious of hazardous attitudes. The student pilot in the story probably exhibited all 5 of them: resignation when he was apathetic about learning, macho and invulnerability when he took excess risks, anti-authority by violating federal law and the rules and restrictions he was required to follow, and impulsivity by embarking on an unplanned and frankly bizarre flight at 4 o'clock in the morning. Looking at the big picture and thinking outside the box for a moment, consider that pilots as a group often spend a considerable amount of time convincing others how safe flying is that sometimes we do too good of a job. As a flight instructor, I've done this myself because the vast majority of prospective students that walk in the door of a flight school are nervous about safety and are looking for reassurance. Unfortunately, this does a disservice to the minority of people who fail to appreciate the dangers of flight. The reality is that the safety of general aviation is mostly up to each individual pilot's attitude. On that note, many new students wonder whether or not they should take a ground school course before they start flying. Advice commonly given is that ground school will be confusing without any in-flight experience and that it can wait until later. I think there is truth to this and have even repeated the advice myself, but I've started to wonder if this is really the best approach. Perhaps there should be some kind of pre-ground school. This would not be like a simple seminar on how to be a pilot, but a real educational course for prospective pilots that teaches some of the fundamentals of flight without making their head spin with overly advanced information. Such a class could even have a lesson on decision-making and risk management, including discussion of accidents like the ones featured on this channel. I've avoided using the word accident to describe this event because as soon as the student pilot decided to violate the rules and his instructor's sage advice and go flying in darkness and bad weather, his fate was sealed. Unfortunately, he also sealed the fate of the friend he brought with him. But the accident chain really started much earlier with dishonesty, having a disdain for rules, apathy towards learning, and unfortunately drug abuse. While some believe government laws and regulations exist to make their lives more difficult, that would be an overgeneralization. It is often said that aviation rules are written in blood. Whether due to a personality flaw, a medical condition, drug influence, ignorance of risks, or probably a combination, the student pilot embarked on an all but impossible flight, virtually guaranteeing 2 young deaths.